Okay, nice to see you all here. My name is Åsa Hirsh. I work at the university, or Jönköping University, normally as a researcher and a teacher of teacher students, and also having a lot of courses for working teachers and principals and so on. I've been a teacher in compulsory school myself for 15 years, mostly in secondary school, teaching Swedish and English. But now I have been at the university since 2009. Hi, welcome. And what I am presenting here today is sort of coming from what I have been doing the last couple of years within my field of research, and what I'm doing right now also in a research study, and how I find that these two meet. I identify myself mainly as an assessment researcher. So I have for a number of years taken great interest in the development sort of formative assessment practices and so on. And I've called this presentation Formative Use of Assessment Information because it's the use of the assessment information that it's all about for me. That's my interest. It's not the assessment itself, but the use of assessment information. So formative use of assessment information, shaping students or students' opportunity to learn, I call this. And what I will be talking about for the next 40 minutes or so will be formative assessment and how it can be understood. I will depart from, God, this is really big, research review that I carried through about 1.5 years ago. I will also talk about the concept of OTL, opportunity to learn. And I will be talking about turning the formative lens towards instructional practices, if I get this microphone to stay up. So what I'm doing here, I'm coming from my perspective, and I want to be clear about that, because we talk a lot about conferences like this, we talk a lot about the method and what works and so on, and I am very humble to the fact that you can come from different theoretical perspectives, you have different research interests, and I'm coming from theoretical perspectives that stem from sociocultural views and situated cognition. So I bring this into the field. And I'm not saying that this is the way to do it, but it's my way to do it. And that's the understanding that I bring into this field. And this will be the basis also for this presentation. Another basis for this presentation is this review that I did together with a colleague 1.5 years ago. It's a research review called Formative bedömning på 2000-talet, Formative Assessment in the 21st Century, financed by the Swedish Research Council, Vetenskapsrådet. Me and a colleague, Vivica Lindberg, we had, for 6 months, we studied almost 400 research studies on formative assessment. And we wrote a review, and this is also a basis for what I'm going to talk about today. And the third thing here is a study that I'm involved in right now about lesson and learning study as tool for teacher-driven school development. We are in a 3-year project, a number of researchers and teachers together in Sweden and in Tanzania. And we are about to finish this 3-year project now and writing it up, and we have done a number of studies. And for me, as I'm coming in, I'm not a lesson learning study researcher, but I'm learning a lot right now. And for me, coming from the assessment field, it's very, very interesting to see how these two actually meet. Because what I'm missing here, I find here. And I can also see that they miss out on things here that they can find within the assessment field. So this has been extremely interesting to me where those two fields meet. So first of all, about formative assessment, and now we will shorten it FA. Where do we stand and what challenges do we face according to the review that we wrote? For me, from a Swedish perspective and Swedish school perspective, it's like we've been through a phase for the last decade or so, or perhaps for the last 6-7 years, where we have learned about formative assessment. We have tried out formative assessment. We have adopted methods that are somehow connected to formative assessment, methods and techniques. And I've written a question under here. Perhaps we have seen formative assessment as the savior of the school system. The formative assessment is the answer to everything. I think that we are about to enter, or perhaps we have already entered, a second phase where we start to think about what we actually have learned, where we start to think about what we have tried, and where we start to think about how we have adopted those methods or techniques that are sort of have become synonymous in a sense with formative assessment. And we ask ourselves if we have been saved by formative assessment. This review that we did was very much for me about what lessons can be learned. If there is reason to be critical, and if a critical stance means a disqualification of formative assessment. I would say no to that last question. A critical stance does not mean that you disqualify formative assessment. I don't. I can say that from the start. I definitely don't. But it means that there is room for improvement. And this, what I'm presenting today, that's the way I see it. And there are other ways to see it as well. First of all, going back to the roots for a short minute or so, we have talked about formative assessment, or used the concept of formative assessment actually for quite a number of years now. Already in the 1960s, Scriven wrote a book called The Methodology of Evaluation, and a few years after came the Handbook of Formative and Summative Evaluation by Bloom, Hastings and Maddows. And in these two, the concept, the formative, the term formative, and the use of, in these two books they talked much about the use of assessment information to evaluate and adjust curriculum and instruction. So these are actually the roots, using formative assessment information to adjust curriculum and instruction. And then Sadler wrote his text mainly about feedback in the late 80s, and he also writes about assessment information feeding back to teachers. He writes very much about assessment information feeding back to teachers and teachers' instruction. I use the word instruction for instead of teaching, but with instruction I mean undervisning. Feeding back to teachers and teachers' instruction and to students, but with a lot of emphasis on feeding back to teachers and teachers' instruction. So these are the roots of, basically these are the roots of the term concept formative assessment. And then of course we have the definitions by Paul Black and Dylan William and the Assessment Reform Group and other researchers. There are a number of slightly differing definitions, but basically they are all more or less the same. And this is a definition from 2009 from a text by Paul Black and Dylan William, where they write that practice in a classroom is formative to the extent that evidence about student achievement is elicited, interpreted, and used by teachers, learners, or their peers to make decisions about the next steps in instruction. that are likely to be better or better founded than the decisions they would have taken in the absence of the evidence that was elicited. So I've underlined a few words here. To make decisions about the next steps in instruction. Then an interest ought to be, or from my point of view, an interest, a point of interest ought to be how these decisions about the next steps in instruction are made by teachers. Because this is central. A formative use of assessment information is about making decisions that are better informed. And how are these decisions made? Based on what? What evidence is used and how? This would be, I believe, central to the field of formative assessment. You have all seen this, this sort of schedule on the key strategies of formative assessment, where we ask ourselves 3 questions. Where the learner is going, where the learner is right now, and how the learner should get there. These 3 questions are central, and these three levels of actors, teachers, peers, and sorry about this, it's falling off. The 3 level of actors, teachers, peers, and learners, are central as well. So if we look here mainly at the level of the teacher, the questions would be about clarifying learning intentions and criteria for success, engineering effective classroom discussions and other learning tasks that elicit evidence of student understanding, and providing feedback that moves the learner forward. And in this schedule, the didactic aspects remain quite invisible. When you just look at this schedule, there is nothing about how evidence of students' understanding is used by teachers for the shaping of instruction. There is sort of here, where I have marked in yellow, there is actually something in between engineering effective classroom discussions and other learning tasks that elicit evidence of student learning, and the provision of feedback that moves the learner forward. There is a gap here somewhere where that hasn't been studied very much. So analytical and didactic aspects remain quite invisible. And the question of how evidence is used of students' understanding is used by teachers for the shaping of instruction hasn't been very much studied. We noticed when we did this review of formative assessment in the 21st century. And I would say that when we did the review, of course, we did not read all texts about formative assessment that there is. But we searched for, in databases, we searched for the term formative assessment or assessment for learning, and in relation to compulsory school. Our requirement was that the term had to be in the title or in the abstract or in the keyword of the scientific article or the scientific text, to make sure that formative assessment or assessment for learning was a central concept. If we would have searched for the term feedback only, which we tried, we got about 12,000 hits on that. So we didn't have time during these 6 months to study specifically scientific text about feedback. But a lot of these texts that we did study were about feedback. But there is a gap between here, where I have marked in yellow. So, very shortly, what our review shows, it shows that there is very little research on key strategy 1 and 2. It shows that most studies concern various types of feedback. Either teacher-given feedback, that is a key strategy 3, if we translate it into key strategies. Peer assessment, which is feedback from one student to another, key strategy 4, and self-assessment also, which is feedback to oneself, which is translated to key strategies is key strategy 5. So most studies, most empirical studies, because all of the texts that we studied were not empirical. There were theoretical studies as well. But most of the empirical studies had to do with feedback in one way or the other, and very little about the clarification of goals, very little about this eliciting evidence that we say is so important. Many of these studies that we read showed that various forms of formative strategies have positive effects on learning and student results, but far from all, actually. And the effect, we like to measure in effect and talk about effect sizes, even if we don't know very much about what we actually talk about. When we talk about effect sizes, we like to measure in effect sizes. The effect is often quite modest, often quite small, and small-scale interventions are very common. When I say small-scale interventions, it can concern one class of pupils, 20 pupils, sometimes 10 pupils, and still we talk about effect sizes, which is not statistically okay to do, but it's done in these studies. So the effect is often quite modest. Small-scale interventions are common, and exceptional circumstances are common. And what do I mean by exceptional circumstances? I mean that these studies are often carried out like in classes with specially gifted students, or in schools in areas where students come from wealthy homes, and these kinds of exceptional circumstances are quite common, and they are problematized in these studies. But when research is translated into more teacher-friendly texts, they take these things away. A lot of the methodology and the problematizing is taken away. But exceptional circumstances are common, and therefore it's difficult to know what it would have been like under ordinary circumstances. Our review also shows, well, we found a word here, a term, context blindness. There was a critique in many of these texts that the research into formative assessment tend to be context blind. The same methods and techniques are assumed to work irrespective of contextual conditions. For example, contextual conditions like age. Certain ways of working are expected to work whether the students are 7-year-old or whether they are grown-up students studying in higher education, or class composition or whatever, but especially age. Many studies were carried out in higher education, for example. Meta-studies highlighting general effects of formative assessment were criticized in other theoretical studies. These meta-studies are critiqued because so many disparate phenomena are gathered under the same umbrella term. Formative assessment is about clarifying goals, it's about eliciting evidence, it's about giving feedback, it's about peer assessment, it's about self-assessment. And we call all of this together, we call it formative assessment, and we search for some kind of generic effect in this. That's what is done in meta-studies. You can, in these meta-studies, they sort of take together studies. There can be 20 studies carried out in higher education on peer assessment or peer feedback. So there can be 20 studies carried out in higher education. There can be 2 studies carried out in upper secondary school, and there can be 2 studies carried out in primary school. And you sort of take all this together and you get one effect size, saying something about how effective peer assessment is. And peer assessment must be a very different phenomena in primary school if you compare to higher education. I use peer assessment with my students in higher education. They are reading each other's text. They are opponents and respondents, and they are discussants at each other's texts. It's very effective in higher education, but working with peer assessment in primary school must be something very different. So it's very difficult to compare this, but still it's done in these meta-studies. And you say that together peer assessment gives an effect size of 0.7, for instance. So what does that say about the effectiveness of peer assessment in primary school if most of the studies are carried out in higher education? And that's what I've written here. Reviews and meta-studies highlighting general effects are often built on research carried out in higher education. Very many studies are carried out in higher education. And still it is used to promote the use of formative assessment in primary school, for instance. And you don't notice this unless you go very deep into the texts that you read, and when you check the references and you see this reference, it's published in a journal for higher education. And normally you don't read the texts like that. I'm not normally doing that either, but when we did this review, we did. And we saw this very clearly. So when such research is popularized and disseminated to the teaching profession, aspects like sample, which samples are used, for instance, how big is the sample, and methodology, these aspects are seldom visualized or problematized, because you need to leave things out if you want to make texts more reader-friendly, so to speak, and these aspects are often left out. We also saw in our review that there is a tendency, quite a strong tendency actually, that this has become quite instrumental. Many teachers claim to work formatively in their classrooms, but research shows that it's often instrumental, meaning that methods and techniques related to the key strategies are used as activities. Yeah, teachers answer, yeah, I work formatively. I use the mini whiteboards, I use the colored cups and so on. I use the lollipop sticks with the names on them and so on. I work formatively. But it remains unclear how assessment information is used as mean for analysis and reshaping of instruction. Mini whiteboards and colored cups and so on, especially mini whiteboards, are used as an activity, and it's not a bad activity, of course, but teachers couldn't always answer how they used this assessment information that was elicited for the interpretation and for analysis, feeding back to instruction. So in some studies, they call this pseudo-formative practices, when you sort of use the techniques, but they are more or less merely techniques. So then some researchers call these pseudo-formative practices that evolve. It also showed the review about student experiences that there were very, very few studies. The student's voice is seldom heard. Teachers are studied. School leaders are studied. Observations of methods are done, but students are seldom asked in these studies. So we know very, very little about how students perceive and are affected by various formative assessment strategies. Among all these 400 studies, we had 10 or so studies dealing with student voices, students' opinions, students' experiences of various formative assessment strategies. So we know, because so we have been told, formative assessment is something good. We have been told for the last years. So many teachers use various methods, and in this there are aspects that need to be considered. And those 10 studies that we had among these 400 actually sort of hearing students' voices. Many of them were about peer assessment. And these studies show that low-achieving students may be negatively affected by peer assessment, which perhaps it's not so strange. I choose to show you an example of this. This is a case study. A case study will not get very much attention. The research that gets attention nowadays is pretty much the research that shows effect sizes and numbers. But a case study, in this case, 4 students have been studied. Can we learn something from studying 4 students? I think we can. 4 low-achieving students and their teacher were observed, and they were interviewed. This was in Hong Kong, and these were teenagers. They were 14, 15 years old, and these students expressed that peer assessment makes them feel embarrassed and inadequate. And this is just a short excerpt from one of the interviews where 3 students are being in a focus group interviewed, and they talk about peer assessment like this. And this is in English, the subject of English as second language. Kylie says, it's because our English proficiency is very low and we can't really assess the performance of others. For example, we don't know if grammar is good or not. And Yale says, you will have to think about how to translate what you want to say into English and then say it. If not, you will be wasting a lot of time. But sometimes you don't even know how to pronounce the word that you want to use. What can you do then? And Veronica says, so I mainly write down things like body language and eye contact because I think in terms of ability, we are not good enough to assess others' performance. And Kylie says, we're not good enough to do so. So this illustrates a problem with peer assessment. These students are supposed to assess the performance of others having an oral presentation. They don't really understand their peers' oral presentations, what they are saying. Perhaps they know what they want, what kind of feedback they want to give, but they can't find the words for it in English. So they find strategies for that, like Veronica says here. Body language, okay, I can say something about that, but that's the only thing I can say something about. So there are things to be aware of. And this does not necessarily mean that you should stop working with peer assessments, because sometimes we are like a bit of falling into one ditch and then we are falling into another. If there are studies showing that there might be problems with peer assessment, it doesn't mean that we should all stop working with peer assessment, because there are studies showing that peer assessment can be good as well. But it means that you need to be sensitive to the context and the situations where peer assessment may be used. And I think, importantly, we need to care more about finding out what students think and how our work affects them. We may ask them. Research is not good at doing so. There are very few studies hearing students' voices. So this was a bit about what this review showed. So I want to go back to the definition and again to the question, how are decisions about the next step in instruction made by teachers? What evidence is used and how? We found very, very, very few studies concerning this in this material. The studies about, all the studies about feedback given from teachers to students were about measuring effects, but it was not actually about how the feedback affected instruction. It was not actually about the quality of the feedback that was given to the student, but more about measuring students' learning. So on basis of this, I believe that the field of formative assessment needs to be advanced. Every field of research needs to be advanced, of course. And perhaps there is a need for a terminology and a methodology that places teachers' instruction at the center of attention. For those of us who are interested in teaches instruction, we need, I think, a terminology and a methodology as well. So I think we need to position the theoretical understanding of FA depending on what we are studying. And I think we need to develop the ability and the habit to analyze concrete aspects of instruction. If the elicited evidence tells you that it is hard for students to understand, we need to work with the ability and the habit to analyze instruction, concrete aspects of instruction. I don't mean such aspect as how do I start off my lesson? What do I write on the right board when I enter the classroom? How do I finish my lesson? I don't mean that kind of aspects, but what if a kid has serious problems with understanding something in mathematics? How do we go about that? Those kind of aspects. To show you where I'm sort of positioning myself theoretically, and where assessment, issues of assessment are positioned or might be positioned. I will show you this picture. There could be, one could talk about three generations of understanding, learning and assessment, where the first generation is more the behavioristic tradition, where knowledge is objective, it can be transferred, it can be measured, where assessment is not very problematic, it's right or wrong. It's 0 points or 1 point. So here, summative assessment is not very problematic if knowledge is objective, and formative assessment is not very interesting, perhaps. The second generation of assessment and learning is constructivist, from a constructivist point of view, where knowledge is constructed. It's not objective, it's constructed. And assessment, the interest in learning and assessment is focused on how does the individual construct knowledge. And here we have a lot of the field of formative assessment is here, which is not wrong. We need to be interested in how the individual constructs knowledge, of course. The third generation of assessment is still from a constructivist point of view, but a social constructivist point of view, or a situated cognition or a sociocultural point of view, if you wish. Knowledge is constructed, but learning takes place in a context, and how do we optimize students' opportunities to learn? And I think that here are, within these two, we find the sort of basis for the concept of formative assessment. And some researchers, perhaps some teachers, would be more interested in being here, and I would be more interested in being there. How do we optimize students' opportunities to learn? An opportunity to learn, OTL, is based on a simple theoretical assumption of learning is not something that only takes place inside the student's head, but rather something that takes place in the interaction between teachers and students in an environment that is organized in a certain way. This is actually quite a simple theoretical assumption. And I show you this picture again, which sort of is the picture of my theoretical assumptions. You have the learner here. You have the learner's individual skill range. You have the zone of proximal development. And you have the potential skill range as a result of social interaction. You have social interaction. You have a context. And in this within this context, I think we need to place sort of teacher's instruction and how it is organized. And if you sort of ground yourself in this kind of understanding, formative assessment cannot only concern shaping the student or giving feedback to the student about what to change. It must also concern the reshaping of problematic aspects of instruction and problematic aspects of the learning environment. And this is where the concept of opportunity to learn comes in. It must concern shaping the students' opportunities to learn. In a traditional view of knowledge, we can see knowledge like this. Information transferred from teacher to student, stored in the student's head, and students have had the same opportunity to learn if they have been exposed to the same information like you are exposed to my information here now. Because you have all had equal possibilities to store the information in the head. And I think you're quite familiar with this picture here. For a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb up that tree. We do have all these kinds of students in our classroom. So that's the traditional way of viewing opportunity to learn, but we know that it's not working like that. Because we have an input-intake relation, where input is the information that you are exposed to, and intake is information which has been processed in such a way that it leads to learning. And there is always an input-intake problem with learning. All students who are exposed to the same input do not get the same intake. We all know that. So in order to optimize students' opportunity to learn, we must analyze the gap between input and intake. And we must analyze what is critical for students in order to learn that which is intended. And here, this is what I've learned during the last 3 years when I have been in this lesson learning study as method for teacher-driven school development. During the time that I've been in this project, I've seen that this is what they do there. They are in this gap. They are analyzing aspects of instruction. And they are doing it fruitfully with the help of some concepts. Lesson study is a teacher-driven professional development process that teachers engage in to systematically examine their instruction with the goal of becoming more effective and optimizing students' opportunity to learn. So the lesson study process, I'm sure that you are well aware of it, is about setting goals. If it's the first time you do it, it's about setting goals. It's about planning and designing lessons jointly, often in a group. It's about implementing and observing is a key word here. And it's about reviewing and refining what you have implemented during the lesson, assessing that, and set new goals, and so forth. That's a simplification of the lesson study method. It's about planning, teaching, observing, and critiquing lessons and instruction, actual lessons and aspects of mathematics or English or home economics or whatever. And lesson study does not have the concept, the theoretical concept of learning study. In learning study, there seem to be, when we have interviewed the principals and the teachers in this project that we are working in, there seem to be two concepts that are very central. The first one is the learning object, the LO. And the learning object is not exactly the same as a curricular goal. But the learning object is a specific ability in relation to a content which the teacher hopes that students will develop and or understand. That's an important concept in a learning study. Another important concept is the concept of critical aspects. And critical aspects is about finding that which is critical for students to understand and develop in order to reach the learning object. And the questions sort of that you need to ask yourself in this process is, for instance, what does it mean to have that ability in this group of students? Because it doesn't mean the same to have a certain ability when you're 10 years old as it does when you're 16 years old. What does it mean to have this ability in this group of students? What do you know when you have this ability? What is it actually that you know when you know something? And what is necessary to understand in order to develop this ability? for the students in this particular group? What do they really have to understand? What is critical for them to understand in order to develop this ability? That's what's the third question about here. What aspects of the content can be critical for the students' understanding? And, of course, how can we teach in order to enable understanding among students? This is a very powerful way of directing attention to aspects of aspects of instruction and analyzing aspects of instruction. And in this, the observation is crucial. The actual observation is crucial. It's with the help of the observation that you get the concrete and specific basis on which the analysis must be based. So observation can be peer observations in the classroom, but it could also be video recording. It can be both. And these are used in learning studies, and then you get some very concrete material to watch, to analyze, to see what aspects of the actual processes going on in the classroom are critical for the students. You can find out things there that shows you that I'm the problem. It becomes very clear to some of these teachers that we have in our project that they found out I'm the problem here. I'm not clear enough. I'm not doing this clearly enough. And we don't find that out unless we really observe, unless we really analyze. So time is running out, just a few minutes left. So this is what I see when I come in with my perspective, with my theoretical perspective that is firmly grounded in sociocultural views and situated cognition. That's mine. Others can have other perspectives. And from what we learned by doing this review of almost 400 research studies into formative assessment, and by combining this understanding with the understanding that I got during the last 3 years when being part of a lesson learning study project, I think that we can see that these can sort of marry each other. And if we want to study formative use of assessment information for the shaping of teachers' instructional practices, I think we need to look more at models like the LLS is providing. So that was what I had to say, and perhaps you have some questions. There are just a few minutes left, but